Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar here with Boulder Advocacy. My name is Andres Esparza, Grassroots Engagement Director here at the Conservation Lands Foundation. I see a lot of familiar names on the board, folks who have attended the previous two webinars, a bunch of new ones. For those who are returning, thanks for coming back for another webinar. For the new folks, I'm really glad you're here for this webinar. Today's webinar, we're going to be working with Tim Mooney, David Feynman, and Jocelyn Torres as we talk about as election season gets closer and as we look ahead to the next election in 2 more years and 4 more years. We here at CLF and working with our Friends Grassroots Network are constantly asking ourselves, how can we further engage? How are the ways that we can connect public lands and the public lands message and elevate it in the national, local, county, state conversation when it comes to who's in office, who's making decisions on our landscapes, and how can we, like I said, be a part of that discussion so that public lands are a part of the central message of who we put into office to represent us. The first webinar a month and a half ago focused on advocacy, what is and is not advocacy, what are the rules, and what are we allowed to do given a lot of our 501c3 status. The previous webinar focused on voter engagement, whether it's get out the vote campaigns, voter education in a sense. This campaign is a little bit more direct, and I think when it comes especially to how we as friends groups operate in our local landscapes, in our communities, I think this is the meat of it all, of the greatest impact we can have, which is voter education, voter guides, but most importantly, when candidates, whether it's for city council, for governor, for president, and senators, representatives, any elected officials, when they come through our communities, we have an opportunity to ask them questions. We have an opportunity to ask them questions in person at town hall meetings, electronically, and we have the ability to share that and make sure that when folks are voting, they know all the facts and we get perspectives from all of our potential candidates. So today is going to be all about how we engage with potential candidates, elected officials, and how we make sure that that feeds into having public lands as an agenda item when folks go into office. Our final webinar, and I'll talk a little bit about it on the tail end, is an advocacy Ask Me Anything. So if throughout this whole webinar or the previous two, you've been having ideas swirl in your head about things that you could do as an organization this year or in the coming years, the next webinar is a really good chance to get those ideas out, talk to a couple of folks from Boulder Advocacy and see what the best way forward might be. So I wanted to quickly turn it over to a couple folks here at CLF, David Feynman and Jocelyn Torres. David Feynman is our Government Affairs Director, and he has some great insight on engaging with elected officials early on, building relationships and how that can benefit the public lands messaging and campaigns in the future. And then chatting with Jocelyn Torres right after that about some ways that it's played out and how it's been successful. And then we'll turn it over to Tim to focus specifically on the ways that we can engage and best practices. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to David Feynman and turn my mic and webcam off. And David, hand it off to Jocelyn. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andres, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. It's good to be connecting with you. And as Andres said, I just wanted to take a minute before we dive into the whole presentation to impart on everybody the importance of building relationships with elected officials or people running for office from the level of president down to city or county commission, and why it's important. It's never too early or too late to do that. Whether you're working with a landscape like Bears Ears that has huge national level emergent issues that require direct advocacy, or whether you're working with a landscape that right now has no issues that you need elected official engagement on, having that relationship and starting on it now, if you don't have it, with either the person who's currently occupying an office at the local, state, or national level, or somebody who is aspiring to, will put you in the best position tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now, have the relationships and the level of education for those people occupying those offices at the time that you need them. And I hope something you've learned if you participated in the previous webinars, and you'll hear it on this one as well, is that engaging with candidates and people who are currently in office is not either against the tax code of your organization, and it's also not inherently political. Advocacy is about educating. And what I hope comes across from these webinars is that by engaging with candidates, you're just educating them on the work you do as an organization, the values and the importance of the landscape you're wanting to protect, and why they should care about it. And if you're educating the people who are in office today at the county level, they might be a congressperson 2 years from now. Or if it's somebody who's running for an office today, they might be in office 2 years from now. If they understand now who you are, what you do, and the places you work to protect, that will only put you in a better position down the road when there's a crisis you might not be anticipating today. And I think Jocelyn's going to talk a little bit about how that, in certain places where we do work with folks on the ground, has manifested itself. So, Jocelyn, are you there? Okay, I'm not sure if Jocelyn is with us. So, Andres, should I hand it off to you, or do we want to just go into the webinar with Tim?
We can go ahead and pass. Oh, there's Jocelyn, so I will.
There she is.
Her.
We see you, but we cannot hear you.
We seem to be having some technical difficulties with the sound on Jocelyn's end. So for now, so we don't spend too much time, I just want to turn it over to Tim to go into this presentation, and then we'll save some time on the tail end with Jocelyn. So Tim, it's all yours.
Great. Yes, definitely. Well, looking forward to hearing from you, Jocelyn, once we get the audio stuff figured out. Technology, am I right? Hi, everybody. If you were with me last week, I'm still Tim Mooney, and today we're going to be talking about the second part of the rules of the game, election season advocacy. And I really wanted to double down on what David said here. I'm going to be talking about some of the rules around a lot of what you can't do, because that's sort of how the rule is written. But I'm going to spend as much time as I can possibly to talk more about what you can do around election season on the topics that we're covering this time around. If you didn't have an opportunity to join last time, which I think was 2 weeks ago, I believe that that's going to be available to you as well, and we can touch base on that with details on how to watch that. The Ask Me Anything next week is going to be on any of the topics covered throughout the series. So that includes lobbying activity, election-related materials that we did last time and this time, in fact, anything having to do with nonprofit advocacy. My colleague will also be joining as well. So we've got lots of attorney brains for you to pick on with questions and whatnot. But let's jump into it. Quick reminder of who I am, who we are, for those of you who are new. Alliance for Justice is a national association of 120 organizations. We're committed to progressive values and the creation of an equitable and just and free society. The other side of the office is working a lot on judges these days. They're very busy, as you can probably imagine. My side of the office, this is where I sheepishly admit that we are the leading authority on laws governing nonprofits. So that's, I guess, why I'm here. So let's jump in here. I'm not going to go through this in the line-by-line manner as I have in the past. What I really want to underscore here is the distinction in that bottom row. 501c3 public charities like your organizations and my organization, Alliance for Justice, like CLF, we are absolutely prohibited from doing anything that supports or opposes a candidate for public office. In other words, all of our activities have to be strictly nonpartisan. And David put it really, really well. Just because you're getting involved with candidates doesn't necessarily mean you're acting in a partisan way. There's a whole host of things that we can do as 501c3s around elections. But the big rule is you're just not allowed to do anything that's partisan in nature. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, you can't even do it in a way that's sort of on the snide. You know, it can't even smell like you're doing anything to support or oppose candidates. And I'll get much more into the details on all of that. And we talked about it, of course, last session as well. You may notice that there are other types of nonprofits that are engaged in partisan political activity, especially and notably in the conservation and environmental movement. There's tons of organizations that will get out and do endorsements. They'll do issue advocacy that it clearly shows preference for or against candidates. That's because they're not 501c3s. They're 501c4 organizations. And as a secondary part of what they do, tax law says, yeah, you're allowed to do things that support or oppose candidates. So if you're ever a little bit confused as to why you can't do things that other conservation groups can do, it's because your tax treatment is different. You're allowed to take donations and confer tax deductibility to those donations. C4s, 527s, the other types of political groups that are allowed to do partisan work, they can't do that, and that's the real big difference there. For more on kind of filling in this chart, we can refer back to last week's and probably the week or the session before as well. But let's spend some time on these rules. Reminder, 501c3s can be active participants in election season. In fact, I feel like it's a disservice to your community and issues that you're working on to cede the territory of election season to other types of organizations. You are experts on public lands, you are experts on conservation matters, you need to be engaged and active during election season. But as I said before, you are just simply not allowed to support or oppose candidates running for public office. There's a lot of space between those two poles. Now, as I mentioned, the whole analysis of this rule seems like kind of a bright line rule, right? You're not allowed to support or oppose candidates. It seems like it should be very clear what one side is and what the other is. But as it turns out, this is an area of law where the IRS applies what we call facts and circumstances analysis. And what that essentially means is that it looks at all of the factors, all of the things that your organization is saying, all of the things that the candidates are saying, and it looks at it in context together. Some communications that I'm going to be talking about today, in fact, I've got at least one example. Some communications are really, really safe to do away from an election, but become progressively riskier as you get closer to an election. And there are certain factors where if you knock out one piece of the communication, it's perfectly safe. But if you keep including it, it may become what I like to call a red light scenario, or something that's a very risky scenario for a 501c3. The one thing that I really like to emphasize here is that context matters in all of this, but your intent does not. I'll repeat that. Context matters. Everything that's going on matters, but the fact that you don't intend to support or oppose a candidate in your communication is not a factor that the IRS looks at. So sometimes you may say, look, we were intending on this just being an issue advocacy piece. We only care about the issue. We don't care about the election. I mean, we sort of do in a sense that we want folks to be elected that will support our positions, but that's not what the purpose of this whole thing is. Well, from the IRS perspective, they don't care whether your intent was not to influence an election. They just care if it looks like you did. So really important takeaway on that. So here's the deal with all of the different topics for 501c3 election related activity. The last session, I covered these two boxes: voter reg, get out the vote, voter protection. So for more on that, go check out the January 28th session. We've got that available. Again, we'll cover how you can access that later. For this session, for the rest of the hour, we're going to be talking about issue advocacy during an election season, voter education, and candidate education. These are three things, well, actually, all five of these things, actually, I guess there's six. All of these things you can do as a 501c3. You just got to make sure you're not doing anything that looks like you're supporting or opposing a candidate. Let's talk about issue advocacy, because frankly, I think this is the most important thing for folks in 501c3s to understand, that you can continue to push your policy proposals and to oppose bad ones all the way through election season. It is a misnomer that 501c3s need to shut down during election season. You may need to alter some of the things that you're saying and how you're saying them, but you absolutely can continue your advocacy on issues through election season just by following the general rule, which is don't look like you're supporting or opposing a candidate. Here's how we do that. Guidelines that I would have you follow. You want to focus more on issues than criticizing or supporting people that are running. So in other words, as long as you're focused on issues, it's more likely than not that the IRS is going to find that to be a favorable thing. You want to avoid talking about issues in a way that seems like a candidate's qualifications. In fact, that's actually a really central theme for most of the IRS rulings in this area. You want to avoid referring to voters or the election. Now, that may be kind of hard, of course, when you're talking about voter education and things like that. So this is not an absolute, but when you combine issue advocacy with the election, that tends to work against you, in terms of the analysis. The closer you are to the election, I talked about this before, you want to avoid identifying a candidate by name or image. And there's some things that we can do to kind of massage that a little bit so that you're more likely to be focused on issues rather than candidacies, even if they are sitting incumbents. That's the trickiest thing, right? If you've got a sitting incumbent that you've been critical of on issues for the entire term that they've been in office, just because they're running for re-election doesn't mean that you have to stop. But as we get closer to the election, you want to massage things a little bit to make sure that folks are very clear that you're talking about the issues, not that impending candidacy for re-election. Last but not least, this isn't always true, but disclaimers are sometimes helpful. Every once in a while, when I see something that is sort of close to the line where I would say, the IRS might consider this to be something that would be more risky, sometimes a disclaimer can be very helpful, because what it can do is it can say, hey, we're a 501c3, we're worried about the issues, nothing that we do should be taken as support or opposition to a candidate. Now, that's not a talisman that you could just hang up on a wall and assume that you can beat away by making an endorsement for a candidate, which is sort of like the third rail of doing anything for a C3. A disclaimer is not going to help you over something like that. That's that obvious. A disclaimer, though, might be helpful in certain circumstances, and I'll probably cover a few of those as we get going a little bit further on down the line here. Simple, quick guidelines for you. Generally speaking, I want you to look back on the last session for the facts and circumstances analysis, the good and the bad facts. And if you missed that, we'll kind of be covering this through the examples that we've got going on right here. On the screen before you right now is a tweet from CLF. Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley have introduced legislation to I got to look at my big screen. Pardon me for looking away from the camera. Have introduced legislation to make permanent the Oahe region of Oregon. One special attraction in this high desert, the 750-mile Oregon Desert Trail. Read more in that Oregon Life link, and then a couple of hashtags as well. By the way, if you have not been to this part of the state of Oregon, you're missing out. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. In January of 2020, when this is put out, this, I would say, is absolutely green light. Notice how this all looks. It's very focused on the issues. It is mentioning two sitting senators, but it's mentioning them in the context of the legislation. This is a classic issue-based communication that would be okay last year, and I think all the way up through the time that this tweet went out. But let's change the facts a little bit here, and I think that this will maybe show how context matters in the analysis of all of this. Let's assume, let's get in a time machine and go forward to October 2020. You may want to join me in all of this because there's a lot of things that are going to be happening between now and October, but here we are, October 2020. What changes given the proximity to the upcoming election? Well, there's two names on this tweet here that are of note. Both of them are sitting Oregon senators. Well, Ron Wyden is not up for re-election this fall, but Jeff Merkley is. So when you align a communication that's issue-based, that shows support of a single issue with someone who is running for re-election, all of a sudden that changes the analysis. I think that you could very easily say Senator Ron Wyden has introduced new legislation, and that's still a green light. He's not running for re-election. This has nothing to do with the election whatsoever. Nobody could take it that way. But I would say by mentioning Senator Merkley closer to the election, that could be perceived as showing support for Senator Merkley's re-election. Now, one other thing, you could make an argument that since Senator Merkley is facing, I think if I'm not mistaken, at least some tacit primary challenges right now, there are some situations coming as we get closer to Oregon's primary where you want to be a little bit careful too. Remember, primaries are as much elections as general elections are. But just to put aside that complication to here, I know that come October, it's likely that he's going to be the Democratic nominee, and you can kind of see how that could be taken as a potential support of the candidacy. Again, remember, context matters, intent does not. So that's why I give it a yellow light in all of this. What would be a way to make this tweet be perfectly safe and absolute green light by making one simple change? That would be by removing the reference to Senator Merkley. Just talking about Senator Wyden would be perfectly fine, not running for re-election, talking about an issue, that would make it a pure green light. That's why I give this kind of a combo yellow and green light. So again, context really matters when it comes to these types of things. And this is an example of shifting the timeline a little bit can make a difference between a green light and a yellow light. Another CLF tweet. Again, I'm going to turn to my big screen because my eyes cannot read the itty bitty type on my little one where my camera is. This is a retweet from Representative Holland. Hashtag Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante are sacred ground. The Trump administration is attacking our communities and didn't consult tribes when they shrunk our public lands. So it's a retweet from that. Now, this is another example of a green light right now. Now, Representative Holland is probably going to be running for re-election further on down the line, so perhaps that might go to yellow later on, but right now, absolutely fine. You'll also notice that it mentions the Trump administration. So now I think it works just fine to mention Trump away from the election. The closer to an election, you could make a few changes there to maybe decrease the volume of that a little bit. You could just refer to the administration. You could refer to the administrative agencies that are involved here. You could go after BLM or whatever other agencies are responsible for some of these policy changes. By removing references to candidates, the closer you get to an election, you can keep up with your issue advocacy with having a much lower chance of running afoul of the rules against electioneering. So we're going to give this a solid green light for, when was this put out? February 6th, not too long ago. Let's look at a couple of things that are, you probably would realize right away, are absolute red lights. Any kind of iconography, any kind of redoubling of the campaign themes and things like that, these are two examples of absolute red lights that you want to stay away from. Yeah, it doesn't say vote for or vote against. You don't need to, as a C3, to say anything, what we call the magic words, vote for, vote against, elect, defeat. Those don't matter to C3s because the line is much further away from that. Again, it's more like a smell test. Does it look like in any communication that you're giving, putting out there, that you're supporting or opposing a candidate? You look at these two bits of art, shall we say. It's very clear one way or the other. One's very clearly supporting, one's very clearly opposing. You can't come within an area code. You can't come within a zip code of something like this. It's way over the line. That's why it gets a red light. Let's take a look at another CLF tweet as well. By the way, this stuff all applies to things outside of tweets. Just tweets are really nice to use as examples because they're nice and tight and small and able to get across a point really easily. Kind of the whole point, I guess. Again, sorry, apologies for moving away from the camera here. Penley, Bernhardt and Associates. Oh, this is a good one, by the way. Penley, Bernhardt and Associates may not be a real estate company. That's hysterical. But they are using their positions to sell off our public lands. Activists held an open house protest in Grand Junction to remind the Interior Department their responsibility is to the American people, not the highest bidder. Okay, I loved the whole concept of the BLM folks putting things up for sale. What a very, very funny and very effective piece of advocacy right there. This is absolutely a green light because, again, very issue-based, doesn't get into elections. The thing that I think is great about this is a great example of something that I think has real power, real staying power as a message, even right up to an election. Why? Does not mention Trump by name, doesn't mention the administration, stays far away from it. Where's it focused on? It's focused on the BLM folks. That makes a big difference there. They're not running for election. Well, I assume they're not running for some other type of office. I probably should have looked that up. Assuming they're not running for some other separate office, state, local, federal, whatever, is a great example of hard-hitting issue advocacy that you can continue to do. One other thing that I want to mention as part of all of this is that continuing a track record of advocacy is important. It's an important factor that the IRS looks at. So as long as you've been critical of an official, even if they're running for re-election, if you were critical long before they filed, long before they got involved running for re-election or running for a different or higher office, you're actually in good shape. You've protected yourself because your advocacy shows that you care about the issues, not the election. So that's another important takeaway that I want you to have from all of this. Start early, Start often, continue at the same level, be mindful of how things look and feel the closer you get to an election. Start removing references to candidates by name as you get closer, and you're going to be in great shape. But focus on those issues. That's the number one thing. As I mentioned, of course, I've been using Twitter as my prime example source here, but filender should go without saying. Rules that apply to print and verbal communications also apply equally to online methods of communication. So all of these rules apply whether you're getting involved in broadcast advertisements, print media, or online type of stuff. The same rules apply. When it comes to social media, I'm here to tell you, these rules were principally written in the 1970s. So not only did they not think about the revolution of the internet, they are way before the time of social media and all of that. So we're going based on best practices and frankly, best guesses amongst attorneys and the community that I practice in on how this all works in the social media context. Again, facts and circumstances analysis, but applying it to the very special world of social media. Here's what we think. Be sure you know what you're liking, retweeting, and linking to, because the one thing we do know about internet when it comes to these rules is the IRS considers everything you directly link to as part of your message. It's incorporated by reference is our legal term of art there. So if you have a link, if it has something that is not allowed, it's considered part of your message and you've gone across the line. So be very mindful of what you're linking to or friending or following or whatever. Be very careful when you are linking to, retweeting, etc., anything from an organization that is not a 501c3 organization. You know when you're linking to a 501c3 that they have to follow the same rules as you. So unless they're blowing through their C3 status, you can generally feel pretty safe linking, retweeting, liking something from a C3. 501c4, 527, a political committee, something along those lines, you don't have that that safety net, as it were, because all of those organizations can do partisan political messages, and sometimes they're not real obvious on their face. So you want to be very mindful anytime you're linking to a non-501c3 entity, what that message is. It doesn't mean you can never do it, but you've got to be really, really careful that they're not doing something that's partisan, because if they do something that's partisan, you link to it, you retweet it, you like it, whatever, you're incorporating that by reference, that could get you into a little bit of IRS hot water. Let's take a look at an example. This is a group that I worked with late last year. And this is a great organization, 501c3 organization. They are called the Reflective Democracy Campaign. They are trying to work on getting more women and people of color elected to office. So here was something. Now, their exempt purpose is fine. They can do that. But just out of the gate, they're the type of organization whose advocacy is around elections and getting people of color and women elected. It's okay as a C3, but all of a sudden, they're almost always in yellow light territory no matter what they do. So here's a tweet from them. I'm going to turn again away from the camera. Apologies again. Reflective democracy is on the rise. See you at the polls. And what we have here, I'm just going to start circling a few things that gives me some pause here. First and foremost, AOC. There is a picture, prime picture of her. This was, by the way, November 6th of 2018. That was election day. So we have a picture of someone who was running for Congress on election day. See you at the polls. Those bunches of things together are a real, it gets a little bit hairy. It's not something I would recommend for so many organizations. One of the things that I think pulls this into from a red light to a green light, or excuse me, a yellow light territory is the fact that basically what they're doing is they're putting out a retweet of an article where their studies on all of this stuff was restated in an article in the Washington Post. So they were basically essentially putting out an article where they were mentioned in the Washington Post. And by the way, they had no control over the picture that was used. This was essentially just saying, hey, everybody, take a look at the article on our work in the Washington Post. It's still a yellow light, though, from my perspective. Why? Because of what they said. See you at the polls, linking with all of these things together. This has a potential to come and be a problem for this organization, because they're a 501c3 organization. I think ultimately, though, they're more aggressive when it comes to the work that they do. It's important work. They want to achieve their goals. So they're willing to take a little bit of a risk and go through a yellow light. Other organizations, your organization maybe, a little bit more risk averse and may never want to go through a yellow light. That's why when it's kind of close to the line, you want to make sure that you understand what are your goals within your organization? How aggressive do you want to act during all of this? Let me throw one other layer on for you as well. I never want anyone to take what I'm about to say as saying, "Hey, nothing matters," and there's no rules. There are rules, and you should follow them. But the IRS is not exactly the greatest organization in the world in terms of enforcement of rules against political electioneering. So layer that as part of your risk analysis. A GAO report, that's General Accounting Office, came out recently, and out of all of the activity from 501c3s over 7 years, so think about all of the election-related activity, all of the nonpartisan voter work, 226 actions were taken. Of those 226, which seems small to begin with over 7 years, only 22 received any kind of an enforcement action. So again, do not take that as saying that you should just blow through whatever you want, but layer on to your analysis that the enforcement of these things is not an automatic, robust type of situation. You need to be very mindful of it, and you should comply with the law 100%. But know when you're sort of worried that you may have misstepped or you linked to something that wasn't exactly, wouldn't have been something that you would have included in your message, that it's not the end of the world, that there are not IRS agents that are combing through all of this stuff, looking to enforce every single minor violation that's out there as part of your analysis. So for some organizations, they're willing to go through yellow lights a little bit more based on that and a variety of other factors. So take that as you will. Following and friending. Be mindful, as I mentioned, of who you are following and friending on social media as a part of your overall work. Non-C3 organizations can become a bit of a problem because they can do really overtly partisan things. If you follow or friend them, then it could be perceived that you are similarly acting in partisan ways. Organizations that do non-electoral advocacy, much safer. So there are tons of 501c4 organizations that all they do is lobbying activity. The affiliated 501c4 that I'm related to, basically, here in the office, Alliance for Justice Action Campaign, historically has not done anything that's partisan in nature. So having linkages between the two tends to be a little bit safer, right? Now, you contrast that with organizations like Sierra Club and NRDC and some other conservation organizations that you may be familiar with that absolutely do work that are partisan in nature out of their C4s. Linking to them is probably not a great idea, especially around election season, because they're going to be doing and saying things that are overtly partisan out of their C4 organizations. So be mindful of that. I also want to talk a little bit about candidate accounts. So as I mentioned before, you're allowed to engage with candidates throughout election season. It's not only okay, I would say, as we're going to talk about in the candidate education section coming up, it's something you should be doing. But be mindful that you want to be connected from a social media perspective to official accounts. In other words, the elected officials' senatorial account or House account or local elected officials account, but not their candidate accounts. It's okay for it to be a lawmaker's official account. It's risky to follow a candidate account. Here's a great example. I am a fan of Elizabeth Warren's open transparency, shall I say here. What you're seeing on the screen right now is Elizabeth Warren's official campaign account. This is that's at eWarren. This is an account that I would say you should not be following, liking, friending, etc., retweeting from. This is going to be all partisan stuff. Technically, her campaign is a 527 organization, and all it does is try to get her elected. You need to stay far away from that. Contrast that with Senator Warren's official account. That is at Sen Warren. This is the account that you could be engaged in to the extent that she is working on public lands policy or other policies that you are engaged in and you are otherwise supporting. This is the one to be working with. And I really appreciate that Senator Warren makes it super, super clear, because not all candidates and not all elected officials are as clear about this. I really like that, I will be using this example forever because it's a really good one. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about personal partisan activity because this comes up all the time, and I think it's really important for folks to know. Everything that I've talked about today, 2 weeks ago, all of these rules cover 501c3 staff and volunteers who act on behalf of the 501c3, as board members, whomever. It does not apply. These rules, and I'm going to say this again, these rules do not apply to people who are acting as individuals on their own time. You are allowed, as a matter of law, as a matter of constitutional law, the First Amendment says you're allowed to work on partisan political things so long as it's on your own time and you're not using the resources of the 501c3 organization. That's a really critically important thing. Many of us who are actively involved in the issues of a 501c3 on our own time go out and support the candidates that we want, either monetarily, we maybe do some door knocking, do some phone banking, whatever it is, it's fine so long as you're strictly keeping it on your own time. Here's a few things that I want you to think about when it comes to all of this. Number one, don't use your organizational resources, and that means staff time. Don't do it on the clock. Don't use your staff email. Don't use your C3 copier. Don't use anything that has to do with organizational resources for any of your personal partisan interests at all. That's the number one rule. Number two, when you're out and about, you want to make sure that you're distinguishing yourself as an organizational representative from yourself as a person. That's why I have all these lovely hats at the bottom. You have multiple hats. You have a personal hat, you have a C3 hat. Some of you may even have a C4 hat. I have a personal hat, C3, and a C4 hat. And it's very important that I make sure I keep track of those things, because if I'm acting in a partisan way on my own time, I want to make darn sure that the organizations that I work for aren't being pulled into all of that. So know what hat you're wearing at what time. Use disclaimers. Remember I talked about disclaimers? This is when this can be particularly helpful. If you are with an organization and it is impossible to divorce you from your organization, that happens with a lot of folks, especially executive directors and presidents and things along those lines. Sometimes when you appear at campaign events, again, on your own time, separate from the C3, you've got to make sure you kind of wave your arms around wildly and say, hey, I know, I'm that person from this organization, but I'm here on my own time. Sometimes you say that if you're speaking, you'll say that at the top. Sometimes if there's a written, some kind of a document that's saying, hey, here's all the people who are supporting this. Here's people who are on this candidate's fundraising committee or whatever. It sometimes will even say name, comma, organization, 501c3 organization, and then a little asterisk that says organization named for identification purposes only. That actually comes from an IRS ruling that says, you know what? Sometimes we actually have to name the organization to be able to distinguish the person from the organization. It's not for everyone. It's only when you've got somebody who really, really is super identified with the organization and you would otherwise think, wait, is that C3 endorsing this candidate? I'm super confused. That's when you would do these types of things and throw that type of a disclaimer in there. If you're speaking at an event and you're worried that you want to put up a little bit more of a firewall, say, hey, I'm here representing myself, not the 501c3 at this event. I'm here as a private citizen. It's a good way to do that. Remember which hat you have on when, and nothing will be as fabulous as the hat in the lower right-hand corner. I'm just here to tell you it's my favorite hat. Princess Beatrice, that is a hat. All right, we've just wrapped up issue advocacy. Let's get into voter education. Voter education is a really interesting headspace to be in here. Remember, the rules say you're not allowed to support or oppose candidates for office, yet you are uniquely positioned in your role as a community leader in a 501c3 to educate the voters on a variety of things. The key thing, however, is you are not allowed to do anything that makes it even remotely look like your organization is supporting one candidate over another. Yet, you're allowed to educate voters and help them make more informed decisions at the polls. How you go about doing that, however, is sort of the devil in the details. So let's take a quick look here. There's two areas that I want to cover in voter education. There's voter guides and candidate debates. There are a lot of other areas as well, and we've got an entire publication called Rules of the Game that you can take a look at. You can download it from our website. I think I've got the link at the end of the show here. If you're more interested in some more details beyond just me yakking away for 45 minutes on a webinar. So let's start with voter guides. Voter guides are really specialized beasts. You're going to see voter guides from partisan organizations a lot, and they're going to very clearly seem like they're supporting one candidate over another. What I'm here to tell you is out of a C3, you have a safe harbor that the IRS has created for you. But the real key here is you're allowed to do a voter guide that doesn't look like you support or oppose anyone. It's all pure kind of League of Women Voters type of example. And that's why I use the League of Women Voters as my my proxy here, because they are the classic C3 voter guide. How does it start? The safe harbor says you're allowed to do these things if you have a candidate questionnaire that's done in a particular way, and you take the answers from that candidate questionnaire and you present it in a very particular type of voter guide. If you deviate from these things, even a little bit, you're outside of the safe harbor and you're in what I like to call facts and circumstances territory, which means that the IRS would look at all of the relevant facts, look at all of the context, and then decide whether or not you are acting in a partisan way. But let's luxuriate here in the safe harbor, because I think that's the easier way of understanding these things. When it comes to the candidate questionnaire, you've got to cover a broad range of issues. In other words, the IRS thinks that it's too easy if you focus on just one particular issue to make any candidate look good or bad relative to your organization's position on the issue. So the solution there is talk about 3, 4, 5 different issue areas where if you know the answer to one, it doesn't telegraph the answer to the other issue areas. That's how you know if they're separated enough. So ask questions in a variety of different subject matter areas. Ask them in a non-biased way. Often that's sort of what's your position on X is probably the best way to do it in kind of a boiled down way. You never, ever, ever as a C3 want to get involved in candidate pledges. We see them all the time, but out of non-501c3 organizations. In other words, hey, candidate X, do you pledge to support public lands by supporting these types of policies? If you do that out of a 501c3, the IRS looks very, 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 very unkindly to those types of things. C4s, 527s, no problem. You're allowed to do things that look and feel a little more partisan, but pledges are an absolute no-go zone for 501c3. So don't consider doing them. Don't consider joining any organizations that are doing pledges if you're with a C3. When it comes to these questionnaires, you want to make sure that you give them out to all of the viable candidates. Who are viable candidates? There's always a couple of candidates in any given election where they're sort of always present, you know, but they don't really have a real chance of winning. So long as you've got a viable, nonpartisan way to exclude folks from this, you're fine from an IRS perspective. But generally speaking, giving these questionnaires to all the candidates and then republishing those answers is the way to go. Now, when it comes to that, you want to make double sure that you're presenting the candidate responses equally. You want to use a similar format. You don't want to edit responses. Here's a great example. This is again from, I believe, the League of Conservation Voters in New Jersey, state folks there. You'll notice the way this is listed, it's very, very similar. Lists the websites the same, has the candidates' official pictures from their websites the same, lists who they are, what party, and then the answers to the questions from the questionnaire. A lot of folks will ask me, in fact, I got a question last week, can I edit things? The answer is it's probably best if you don't, but whatever you decide to do, have the rules set up from the beginning. You can have word counts, but make sure all the candidates have equal responses to those word counts. In other words, don't have a 100 word count for one candidate and unlimited for another. Fair rules present these things equally. If you do decide to do some light editing, that moves you outside of the safe harbor technically, but I think if it's done in an even-handed way and you communicate that beforehand, that would probably be within an okay area for the facts, from a facts and circumstances analysis perspective, but you're outside of the safe harbor. If you want to stay firmly within the safe harbor, don't edit any of the responses whatsoever. Present it like how you see it on the screen right now, and you're in much better shape. You can do it in print, you can do it online. I've seen some interesting scenarios where these types of voter guides are done in a small print run where some of the questions are shown and then there's a link to all of the questions. I think that's probably okay, but again, we're in the realm where we're outside of the safe harbor, but probably still okay from a facts and circumstances analysis. So that's voter guides. narrow area, but might be really, really worthy of your activity. Can't be done in a partisan way. You will see voter guides by C4s that are partisan, that will rank and that will judge and that will give ratings to candidates. You can't do that out of your 501c3. Leave that for C4s and other partisan organizations to do. Let's talk about candidate debates. You may want to get involved in something like this at the state or local level. I actually had an opportunity to work with some folks in New Hampshire before the New Hampshire primary. So I actually have an example of a presidential candidate questionnaire or set of questions that I'm going to be using as an example in a few minutes here. You probably will be working with folks perhaps at more of the local level. Remember, state, local, federal, doesn't matter. These rules apply the same regardless of what office we're talking about here. The procedure for a candidate debate or forum. Oh, let me start off by saying what's the difference between a debate and a forum. A debate is having all the candidates on stage at the same time, having equal opportunity to answer questions. You've seen a lot of debates probably. Forums, technically, we don't have the same safe harbor rules for forums that we do for debates. So we're in facts and circumstances territory with all of that. But I think it's pretty safe, generally speaking, if we apply the same rules and procedures for debates, that they probably apply also to forums. But you want to be very, very careful again. All of those same rules that I talked about matter. Don't look like you're supporting or opposing a candidate. And you've got an additional layer of situation in there is the order of the candidates could create contextual favoritism, which is my last bullet point here. Procedures. Invite all the viable candidates. I talked about viability before. Make sure you have fair rules. Don't give 10 minutes extra for one candidate and 5 minutes less for another. That's not a fair. That's going to get you tagged by the IRS potentially. Impartial moderators are always considered a good thing from the IRS perspective. In the rules, or excuse me, in the safe harbor where they talk about this, they talk about having a separate member of the media take over. I've had organizations that will have local professors within that are subject area experts in the types of questions that are being asked be the moderators. Someone outside of your organization, probably a good idea as an impartial moderator. Have an unbiased audience. That means either open it up to the public, or if it's going to be a ticketed event, make sure each candidate that's coming has an equal amount of tickets available. Equal opportunity, again, 5 minutes for one, 5 minutes for the other. Don't get into uneven opportunity to answer questions. And then don't have contextual favoritism. In the forum scenario, don't give this prime time slot to one candidate at your annual meeting, and then the crickets chirping 2 a.m. Vampires only time slot for the other candidate. You want to give them as close to equal opportunity as possible. If you don't, you may be running into some issues from the IRS. Questions, same deal as with the questionnaire and the voter guides. Broad range of issues, 3, 4, 5 different issues at least. More is even better. An unbiased way of asking them. Don't make it look like you're favoring one candidate or the other in the asking of it. So for instance, if there's an incumbent who is running, asking a question that implies criticism of that incumbent's position on issues is a problem in this area. Again, you have to be even more strictly nonpartisan in appearance and in context than you would in the issue advocacy space. So be mindful of all of that. Debate question topics. You want to make sure you have a broad range of issues. The folks that I worked with in New Hampshire, they were fascinating. It was a coalition of farmers and local food producers. So they had a series of questions for the candidates who were running for the Democratic primary for president. And the broad range of issues were the following. Bam, wow, a lot. They asked questions on climate change, food safety, localizing food, public health, labor issues, trade, corporate influence, on it went. There were tons of issues where if I knew the answer on their stance on the rules for organic food labeling, that wouldn't necessarily tell me their point of view on trade policy, right? So those are at least 2 different areas there. Well, frankly, they had a ton of different issue areas, so I had no worries saying, you know what, this topic list is good. As long as you're at 3, 4, 5, you're fine. Here, I think there was close to a dozen, if not more, and I think there were even more than I'm listing here. An example of a question that they asked was this. Producers in New Hampshire need access to legal labor. What kind of immigration policies can give producers assurance that they will be able to have the kind of labor they require to run their business effectively? Is there anything in there that suggests that it's supporting one of the candidates over another? No, that's absolutely fine. It's not biased towards any candidate or party. And also it doesn't suggest a correct answer. And that's a really important thing right there. And it isn't phrased in a way that pits one candidate over another. It just basically says, hey, what's your position on legal labor in the state of New Hampshire? That's it. That's perfectly fine. It's also open-ended to elicit a long-form response rather than a binary answer. Sometimes when you get a situation with a yes or no answer, that can look like that there's a potential for bias, because if the organization has a particular stance on an issue and you create this yes or no situation where it's pretty clear what your organization's answer is, then it might be considered a biased question. Here, this was asked in a much more open-ended way so that it didn't necessarily look one way or the other for any of the organizations involved in this coalition. That gets a green check mark of approval from me as far as a question goes. So that's just an example there from a 501c3 question at a debate. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful for you if you're considering doing candidate debates or forums. One thing that comes up from time to time, though, is you're going along in your year and you're sometimes going to want to invite folks who happen to be running for elective office to an event that you're doing for a reason that is utterly unrelated to the candidacy of that incumbent. Sometimes it's going to be for giving an award. Sometimes it's going to be an invitation for a policy update for them. Here are the things you need to be really careful about. You really want to avoid strictly mentioning the candidacy in that. If you are not having that person there because they're a candidate, do not say, oh, by the way, this person you may recognize from the campaign trail. Very strictly keep that away from things. Don't time these things, especially an award, to coincide with an election. I would really urge you that if you're interested in giving a public lands benefit award to somebody who's sitting in an elective office, don't do it in an election year. It just looks like you're endorsing them at that point. Keep it far away from an election. Absolutely. You don't need to in these contexts. If it's not having to do with the election, there's no equal opportunity required. So if you're asking someone to come in and give a policy update because of their role on a particular legislative committee, well, you don't have to bring their opponent along just because you are asking them to come for their role as being an elected official. So that's something there. Be real mindful that candidates sometimes don't always do things in your best interest when it comes to election-related activity. You want to make sure that you explain the ground rules to the candidate in writing ahead of time. So just in case if they say, even if you said multiple times to the person, hey, we're inviting you here in your non-candidate capacity to talk about the issues for Bears Ears or whatever. Sometimes they'll slip, fall funny and say, oh, by the way, I'm running for re-election. If you've got something in writing that says, hey, we really don't want you mentioning your candidacy. We're not inviting you here because you're a candidate. We're inviting you here because you're an elected official or you're a policymaker or whatever. Please don't mention your candidacy. If they do trip and fall funny and mention their candidacy, you've got that thing in writing. And that's a helpful thing for you in the analysis in case something comes up. All right, last but not least, candidate education. My joke here is there are lots of candidates and they very often need to be educated by our organizations. Here we go. When it's a threshold matter, if it isn't abundantly clear at this point, you can educate candidates on your core issues. If you're going to do this, I want to make sure that you do a few things, because sometimes you're going to be approached by candidates to be educated. Offer information that you give to these candidates to all of the viable candidates. So if someone approaches you, make sure you give that same information to all of the candidates running for office. At least offer it to them. Never, ever create original information, original material, new material for any candidate, even if they request it. And the big reason here is not only do you violate IRS law with that, you're giving something of value to this candidate that they could ordinarily do by doing it on their own. You're doing it out of a public charity with public charity funds. Huge no-no from an IRS perspective. But you may also be inadvertently or advertently, you may be intentionally violating campaign finance laws as well. You're giving something of value. It's an in-kind contribution to these folks That violates federal election law if it's a federal candidate, and many state election laws if they're state or local candidates. Don't do it. Don't create new information. Publicly available information, no problem. Information that you've already created, no problem. Just also make sure that it goes out to other candidates as well, evenly in the same way as much as possible. One other thing that I don't want you to do is never ever republish anything from a candidate or a campaign. Now, again, this is distinct from them as lawmakers. You can republish things that are part of the official record from a senator's office or from a state legislator's office. That's no problem. But if it's from a candidate campaign, if you republish something, that's considered, again, an in-kind contribution potentially for state or federal campaign finance laws purposes. Do not do that. That is very much across the line. But otherwise, the realm of candidate education is a really fertile area for you to be operating in. Just be nonpartisan. Don't show favoritism for any candidate at all. Offer those same materials to other candidates, even if you don't think that they'd be interested in them. The very fact that you're offering it to them as part of this is broad-based, it's nonpartisan, it's part of being a C3. It allows you to do all of that in a safe way. When it comes to another side of things, okay, all of a sudden, flip it around. Post-election, transition team advocacy is a really important type of thing. Folks, especially newly elected folks who aren't incumbents being reelected, you're allowed to educate them on the issues between the election time and when they get sworn in. This is called transition team advocacy. It's okay to educate transition teams on issues important to your organization. In fact, I would say it's a huge opportunity for you. Recommend transition team members, absolutely. Folks that you think will help them on public lands issues, recommend that person to be part of their transition team. Recommend people for key positions like cabinet and other areas that would be more ongoing after being sworn in. Be mindful that this might trigger some lobbying related activity that my colleague Ronnie talked about, I think 4 or 5 weeks ago. And if you weren't there for the lobbying training, make sure that you know what those rules are. We've got a whole publication called Being a Player on that. Also check out what her presentation was for more on all that. Some advocacy at this stage may fall under exceptions to lobbying. Some advocacy at this stage may be considered lobbying depending on the nature of the communications and who it is that you're talking to. So just be mindful of all of that in terms of transition team advocacy. Before we get to questions and before we get to Jocelyn as well, I just want to remind folks that we are a resource for you that is ongoing past today, past tomorrow, and past next week. If you have questions, I've got colleagues all across the country in offices on the West Coast, in Texas, and here in DC. If you call our hotline or email us or go on our website, we've got fact sheets, we've got publications that I've referenced. Getting in touch with us, there is an attorney every single day of the week, Monday through Friday during business hours, that can answer questions on all areas of advocacy. So if you have a specific question, we can help give you technical assistance. We can't be your attorneys just based on how we're set up, but we can help you march through these rules and maybe help with some of this facts and circumstances analysis, which can be a little frustrating to deal with. We've had a lot of reps on facts and circumstances analyses, so we're ready to kind of tackle all of that. The resources are available right here for you as well. So more available from us as well. I've got time for questions, but I also want to make sure that we've got time for Jocelyn as well, so that we can honor everybody's time. I know we're close to the top of the hour, but thank you all for listening, and I'm gonna give it to Andres, I think, to sort of do the transition, and then we'll maybe do some questions after, or do questions now, whatever works best.
Yeah, first off, Tim, thank you so much. These webinars have been really helpful, and I hope folks that are on are getting a lot out of this and sharing this. I heard reference to several of the previous webinars. You can always go to our website, conservationlands.org, and in our network resources, you can find all of these archived, so you can share them out that way. You can watch them over a brown bag seminar at lunch and talk about how they impact your organization. As we wrap up here, we have a few questions from folks, but I realized in the beginning we skipped over Jocelyn because of some technical difficulties. And I'd like to give her a chance to speak on how this plays out and how we win when we have positive relationships with candidates who are educated on our public lands platform. So Jocelyn, I'll turn it over to you for a few moments, and then I'll jump in and lead off with some of this question and answer session afterwards.
Yeah, and I am only on by phone. The technical difficulties are not lining or helping out with me today. Switch computers and still have problems. I really just wanted to share maybe examples for folks to kind of take what Tim has talked about and put it as an example of something that we've done within the Friends Grassroots Network. A big example, you know, after we designated a lot of the monuments during the monuments era, we did take time meeting with, you know, candidates. This is, you got to think back to 2016 here. Met with candidates and talked to them particularly about the Gold Butte campaign, just where the campaign was, you know, what we as activists were looking to do, and, you know, that we were working with the current administration, which was obviously not up for re-election, but just kind of giving every single candidate the opportunity to hear from us of what we were asking, you know, of the president and that, you know, that was in office, and how that may impact, you know, them if they won their seats or didn't win their seats or whatever, but really just for them to have the information of what was happening in the state that they were running in. And we sat down with every single candidate, as Tim mentioned, you know, whether they agreed with us or not, and we knew that maybe going in, but we still offered the invitation, met with them, and then gave them all the same, you know, one pager of information about this national monument. And, you know, we did that not knowing whether the monument would be designated, and definitely not knowing that Gold Butte would be one of those monuments reviewed by Zinke under the Department of Interior. But, you know, it gave us a foot forward for when the reviews did come about, to really have people in office, you know, the ones that won, they already had the background on Gold Butte before they ever got sworn in. And so that just, I think, helped us out, set us up for success. It wasn't a specific request of those elected officials, since the ask was to the president, but I think on the candidate education front, you know, it just helps you out to have that conversation with everyone, and you don't know, you know, how or when it will pay off, but it usually does on issues.
Awesome, Jocelyn. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We had a few questions that folks have either sent to me privately or put in the question box, and I'm going to read one from Sally Sharp. I believe you're from Great Old Broads, if I'm not mistaken. Your question is, as a C3 org, can we support a ballot measure at the same table as a get out the vote campaign, i.e. providing a computer to register to vote? Can you educate on a valid issue and literally 2 feet away have people register? Where's the line? Tim?
Yeah, great question. Yes, absolutely, you're allowed to do a get out the vote effort around advocacy for a ballot measure. Hit the time machine and go in the opposite direction this time to when Ronnie was talking on our very first session. Ballot measures count as direct lobbying activity, which you're allowed to do. Absolutely, it's kind of the exception to the rule, and I regret not reiterating that during this show here. But you're allowed to do things that support or oppose ballot measures. They're not candidates. It's like a piece of legislation that's before a gigantic legislative body made up of voters, and you're allowed to actually do voter reg and get out the vote for your ballot measure efforts without a problem. Again, this has nothing to do with partisan activity, but you are allowed to do it around ballot measures. One quick caveat to all of that is, when you're active in a ballot measure context, depending on the state, and you'll want to make sure that you've got this nailed down, if you're engaged in ballot measure advocacy, sometimes you may need to register and report as what's called a ballot measure committee, and in some states they'll actually call you a political committee, which is the exact same thing as for partisan political candidate committees. It can be a little confusing. Don't worry about what the state calls it, so long as you're working on ballot measure work and you're strictly on those types of issues, you're allowed to be active in those areas. But be mindful that there might be some additional reporting requirements. One, to the IRS, because it would be considered direct lobbying activity. Check out Ronnie's session for that for more details, and our publication Being a Player, and our publication Seize the Initiative. And also, too, you may have some state level reporting to be engaged in as well. Sometimes voter registration requirements, or I shouldn't say this, voter registration requirements vary greatly by locality and state. There are very specific rules. Are you allowed to touch the voter registration forms? Are you allowed to submit them yourself, or are you strictly not able to? North Carolina, for instance, probably not an area where a lot of you folks are active, but maybe. North Carolina, you absolutely cannot touch the voter reg materials. So know what the rules are. Some states have very, very strict rules on all this. Some are a little bit more laissez-faire about it. They're like, okay, collect voter registration materials and submit it through your organization. Be mindful and know what those rules are so that you don't run afoul of those. But generally speaking, absolutely, you can be right there. You can do ballot measure advocacy combined with voter reg and get out the vote.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim, and great question. We have another question, and again, folks, if you have questions, type them in the question box. Susan had a great question. If the IRS doesn't have time to follow through on all advocacy issues, I think in relation to what you're sharing out, are there PACs or other organizations that look for violations and flag them for the IRS? Other whistleblowers, tattletalers, whatever you want to call them, and how to be aware of that?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, because the other thing that we learned in that GAO report is that there's really only two ways that C3s get into trouble. The first way they get into trouble, and for those of you who have ever filled out a 990, you know what box I'm about to refer to. There's a box on the form 990, your tax return, that basically says, so 501c3, have you ever engaged in any partisan political activity this year? That's my General Akbar, it's a trap a box that you absolutely do not want to check yes to. But lots of organizations mistakenly check yes to that. Some of the enforcement work that I talked about, they just said, oh, that was clearly a mistake of the organization, so they allowed them to amend their 990 and all was fine. The other folks that get into trouble are because of exactly who you're talking about. And sometimes they're 501c3s, sometimes they're C4, sometimes they're corporations, for-profit corporations, but they are people that are engaged and the opposite of the type of policy that you want to do. And they would love nothing better than to take a stick and put it in the front spokes of your proverbial bicycle and have you go end over your handlebars. Happens all the time. I remember years and years ago here at Alliance for Justice, we're very active on judge issues. And so there are some folks that are very aligned differently from our point of view on the types of judges that we should have in our federal judiciary. And so every once in a while, they'll send an intern to come and ask for our 990 and try to find ways to trip us all up. Little did they know that my side of the office, we kind of teach these rules. So I sometimes have to engage in a little bit of extra education for these interns that come and try to stick a stick into our proverbial bicycle wheel. What's the best tactic for all of this, or the best response? Do things as legally as possible. And let me amend that. Be legal, follow all the rules. I almost tripped my own self there. Follow all the rules. You now know how they're written, how they're enforced, how they're put out there. And the second thing is keep very good records. Because if you can show demonstrably that you are following these rules, one of these jokers comes in and tries to trip you up, you don't have to worry about it because you know you've got good records that support all of the work that you did. So if it does trigger an audit and the IRS does come, all you have to do is push that those bunch of documents, hand over those thumb drives, whatever, and the IRS will kind of thumb through it. I'm here to tell you, I got yet another example of this from another attorney who represents some very big deal advocacy organizations that are routinely the subject of these types of attacks, I'll call them. She relayed to me another example of once the IRS came into an organization that I'll leave out, she left it out too, in fact, that once they saw that there were records in place and that there were systems in place to avoid partisan activity, that's pretty much where it was left. So long as they could check the box and say there are systems in place to avoid partisan activity, that was all that was kind of necessary from the IRS's audit perspective. So defend yourself best by strictly following rules, know what they are, know how they apply to you, be good about it, and then should someone try to trip you up, have the confidence that you know that you've always been acting in the right, and what they're trying to do is to make you spend energy and time away from your good work on this IRS audit. I take these kinds of things as a badge of honor and a demonstration that you're doing good work that's getting the attention of the folks that are opposed to you. So rather than be, well, we can be upset by these jokers trying to do this to us, but at the same time, take it as a badge that you're doing something that's got their attention, and they're trying to do a little bit of dirty tricks to try to get you off your game. As long as you're in a good place with all the stuff that you've done, you're following the rules, you don't have to worry about it, and you can just merrily go on doing the types of work that makes them upset. So that's my takeaway for that.
Awesome, Tim. Thank you very much. And I think on that note, if you're doing it right, you're going to be pissing off a few people, and that's good. So thanks
Good
everybody.
trouble, right?
Thanks everybody for joining, hanging out past the hour. We appreciate it. Again, if you have any specific questions, you can always reach out to us or Boulder Advocacy or Tim directly. You'll be receiving a follow-up email with the recording and of this webinar and a few other additional materials. And again, feel free to share this within your network. And if you haven't already register for the last webinar coming up, Advocacy Ask Me Anything, where you'll get to brainstorm through a few great ideas, get inspired by what other groups are thinking, and really start to think about how we as land-based conservation nonprofits are impacting our government, making sure that our issues are being elevated and a part of the national discussion, and really just making sure we're doing it in the most comfortable way possible and always legal. And always knowing where that line is allows us to do the best work possible. So everybody have a wonderful afternoon. And again, reach out with any questions. Thank you very much.